We all tell the exact same lie almost every single day.
Oh, absolutely.
Someone walks up to you, maybe you're grabbing a coffee in the office kitchen or dropping the kids off at school or just, checking out at the grocery store, and they ask, "How are you?" And without a single conscious thought, what comes out of your mouth? "I'm fine."
Or the slightly upbeated version, right? I'm good, just really busy.
Exactly. It's just this absolute, deeply ingrained reflex.
Well, I mean, it acts as a social shield. We say it to keep the friction low, just keep the day moving forward. But beneath that shield, the reality is often drastically different.
And today, we're going on a deep dive to actively shatter that specific illusion. We're unpacking this fascinating document called A Simple Guide to Supporting Unpaid Caregivers, written by Baha and Margaret Hopshire.
It's a really incredible resource.
It really is. And our mission today is to uncover the hidden, intensely exhausting reality of what it actually means to be an unpaid caregiver. And more importantly, we want to look at how to equip you, the listener, with incredibly practical tools to genuinely support the people around you who are quietly, carrying the weight of the world while pretending everything is fine.
Right. And to set the table for this, it's worth noting right up front that this source material operates from a firmly Christian perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point to clarify.
Yeah, so the authors frame caregiving not merely as a nice civic duty, but as a spiritual calling, a mandate to love your neighbor and literally bear one another's burdens. However, the true value of this text extends way beyond its theological roots.
Totally.
The practical frameworks they introduce, the actual human mechanics of how to step into someone else's distress without, making it worse, they are universally applicable. Anyone looking to be a more effective support system for their friends or colleagues is going to find these tools profoundly useful.
Right, because the toolkit works regardless of the worldview you bring to it. And the authors actually open the guide with a story that perfectly captures the danger of that "I'm fine" reflex we just talked about.
The story of Glenn.
Yes, Glenn. And Glenn is the archetype of the everyday, chronically busy professional. He's an executive, he's got kids riding bikes in the neighborhood, and he always just seems to be rushing from one massive responsibility to the next.
Go, go, go.
Exactly. And the neighbors are generally aware that Glenn's mother lives in his basement and that she struggles with alcohol. But the neighborhood dynamic is highly typical. Everyone keeps a respectful, polite distance.
Right, the unwritten rule of suburbia. You see the smoke, but unless the house is actively on fire, you don't cross the property line.
That is exactly it. But then a shift happens. One Sunday morning, the narrator of this guide runs into Glenn in a church washroom. They're just standing next to each other washing their hands, and the narrator throws out the standard low-stakes greeting. He says, "Hey, how are you?"
And we know what's coming.
Right. Glenn, operating on pure autopilot, gives the standard "okay." But the narrator does something unusual here. He actually looks at Glenn in the mirror. He notices the posture, the dark circles, the tension. The guy washing his hands is very clearly not okay.
The shield is cracking.
Yeah. So the narrator turns, breaks the casual social script, and asks again. He says, "How are you doing?" And Glenn tries to hold the line. He says, "I'm fine, I guess."
The classic double down. When the shield is poked, the instinct is just to hold it tighter.
But the narrator refuses to let it go. He reaches out, puts a physical hand on Glenn's shoulder, and asks a third time, "How are you really?" And that is the exact moment the dam breaks.
Wow.
Glenn's eyes fill with tears right there next to the paper towel dispenser. The whole facade crumbles, and he confesses that his dad is actually dying in the hospital with stage 4 cancer.
This is just devastating.
Yeah, it progressed incredibly fast, and the doctors are saying they don't know how much time is left.
And, the text highlights a very raw admission from the narrator in that split second. The narrator feels completely frozen.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, he suddenly realizes he has cracked open this massive vault of grief, and he feels entirely unequipped to handle what is spilling out.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because
Yeah.
to me, Glenn, using that "I'm fine" reflex is basically like, well, it's like putting a piece of thick black electrical tape over a car's check engine light.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. The engine under the hood is literally smoking, the gears are grinding, the temperature gauge is completely in the red, but you just cover up the flashing light on the dashboard, grip the steering wheel, and tell the passengers, "Yep, running smooth, making great time."
Yeah, exactly.
So how many people in our immediate orbit are walking around with this flashing internal dashboard while pretending everything is normal?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the invisible army doing exactly that. The authors pull in some staggering data to put this hidden crisis into perspective. If we look at Ontario alone, just a single Canadian province, there are roughly 4 million unpaid caregivers.
Wait, 4 million?
4 million. That means 1 in every 4 people you pass on the street or sit next to in a meeting is managing someone else's care.
1 in 4. That is a massive chunk of the population.
And the trajectory is even more alarming, honestly. In the next 5 years, that number is projected to grow to 6.5 million. We are looking at a near future where almost 1 in 2 people in your community will be an unpaid caregiver.
That is just wild to think about. Half the people we know.
Yeah, and the physical and emotional toll behind those numbers is immense. The data shows 75% of these individuals report feeling so burned out they legitimately worry if they can physically continue. And 80% report being so deeply tired that they struggle to get basic daily tasks done.
Just operating on sheer fumes. But why is it so hidden? I mean, if 80% of these people can barely function from exhaustion, why don't we see it?
Because the invisibility comes from the nature of the work itself. Caregiving rarely looks like a dramatic movie scene, you know? It's a slow, grinding attrition. It happens in the margins of life.
Behind closed doors.
Right. It's sitting at a kitchen table at midnight, managing incredibly complicated medication schedules and insurance paperwork. It's the physical labor of helping another adult get dressed or navigate a staircase. But honestly, the biggest drain is the cognitive load, the hypervigilance.
The hypervigilant.
Yeah, like waking up at 3 a.m. because you heard a faint noise down the hall, and your brain immediately floods with adrenaline, wondering if there was a fall.
Oh man, that fight or flight response just constantly firing.
Exactly. Over months and years, that constant low-level panic completely rewires the nervous system, and they are absorbing all of this invisible stress while still trying to hold down their regular jobs, raise their own children, and, maintain that smiling facade.
But seeing that the light is flashing under the tape is only half the battle. If we know half the people we interact with are eventually going to be running on this kind of empty, we hit a major roadblock. And that's our own impulse to fix things.
Right, the fixer instinct.
Yeah, the source makes a really profound point about how we try to help. We tend to offer answers. We give advice. But the guide argues that questions are vastly more powerful than answers, and that offering advice is usually completely unhelpful.
And that concept is deeply counterintuitive for high-achieving, empathetic people. When we see a friend in pain, our immediate biological urge is to solve the puzzle. We want to offer a neat solution, or we want to share an anecdote about the time our aunt went through something similar, hoping it, provides a roadmap.
But we want to be the hero with the right answer.
Precisely. But the authors point out a harsh psychological truth. Giving advice in these moments is actually about us. It gives the helper a feeling of control in a chaotic situation. But an overwhelmed caregiver does not need a lecture. They need to feel seen. The text emphasizes that people rarely change their internal state because what you logically tell them. They shift because of how you make them think or feel.
So the tool we need to use isn't a solution, it's the right kind of inquiry. And the guide actually provides a list of these revealing questions, and they are light years beyond a generic, hey, checking in on you text message.
Oh, for sure.
One of the primary questions they suggest is simply, how was your sleep?
The precision of that question is just brilliant. As we touched on with the hypervigilance, caregivers often sleep with one ear permanently on duty. They are listening for the cough, the monitor, the footsteps.
Which completely ruins the architecture of deep sleep.
Exactly. So by asking specifically about their rest, you are signaling that you actually understand the unseen mechanics of their daily life. You aren't just asking about their mood, you're asking about their physical endurance.
Another targeted question they bring up is, how are you eating? Because the stereotype, which honestly is often entirely true, is the caregiver who spends an hour preparing this beautiful, nutritionally balanced meal for the person they are looking after, and then they just stand over the kitchen sink at 9 p.m. eating cold leftover mac and cheese straight out of the Tupperware.
Right. The self-neglect is huge.
Yeah, you are really asking about their self-worth in that moment. Or another one is, how do you deal with stress?
And perhaps the most piercing question on their list is, how do you deal with feelings of guilt?
Wow. Even just hearing that question out loud feels heavy.
It does. And the weight is intentional, because guilt is the silent, constant companion of almost every single caregiver. The inner critic is relentless. I'm not doing enough. I lost my patience and snapped at them today. I should have noticed that new symptom a week earlier.
Or like, I'm neglecting my own kids because I'm spending so much time at the hospital.
Yes, exactly. It's a crushing internal monologue. Giving someone explicit permission to voice that specific emotion to pull the guilt out of the shadows is an incredibly releasing psychological mechanism.
But wait, if I am putting myself in the shoes of someone listening to this right now, my immediate visceral reaction is fear. I mean, I am terrified of prying. This feels intensely intrusive. What if my neighbor doesn't want me poking around in their family trauma or their sleep habits or their deep-seated feelings of inadequacy?
And that apprehension makes total sense. We are conditioned to respect boundaries. But the guide offers a crucial clarification here. This is not an interrogation.
Okay, that's a relief.
Right. You do not trap a coworker in the break room, shine a light in their eyes, and run through a checklist of 8 highly emotional prompts. You select one, you use it gently, and you use it in context. The objective is not to extract a detailed medical report or, force a breakthrough therapy session.
So what is the objective then?
The objective is simply to unlock a door. It is a verbal way of saying, I recognize that your situation is complicated, and I am not afraid to talk about the messy parts if you ever need to.
But asking that question, opening that door, creates a brand new problem. You have just opened a high-pressure valve. And if you aren't braced for what comes out of it, you are going to drop the ball. The source leans on an ancient piece of advice here, pulling from the biblical verse James 1:19, which instructs people to be quick to hear, slow to speak.
Yeah, the authors use that verse to reframe the entire concept of listening, because we tend to view listening as a passive activity, right? Essentially just a waiting period where we stay quiet until it's our turn to talk again.
Guilty as charged.
We all do it.
Yeah.
But the guide completely rejects that. There's a brilliant insight in the text that states if you are not somewhat physically or emotionally tired after listening to someone, you probably have not actually been listening.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me, because I love that concept of exertion. It reminds me of catching a medicine ball at the gym.
Oh, yeah.
If someone tosses you a standard lightweight basketball, you just put your hands up, it bounces lightly off your palms, and it takes zero effort. It's a total afterthought. But if someone throws you a dense 20-pound medicine ball, you cannot just stand there relaxed.
No, you'd fall over.
Exactly. And part of bracing for that heavy impact is preparing yourself to absorb the unspoken elements too. You have to plant your feet, engage your core, and physically absorb the momentum. True, active listening requires that same level of full-body engagement.
Spot on. You are watching the body language. You are listening to the heavy sighs between the words. Because the verbal report and the internal reality are frequently disconnected.
Right.
If a caregiver says, oh, I'm managing, but their jaw is clenched, they're staring at the floor and their breathing is shallow, the active listener catches the medicine ball of that anxiety rather than just accepting the spoken words.
And to catch that ball, you really have to create an environment where it's safe to throw it in the first place. The guide is adamant about the physical space. You have to silence the phone. You have to remove the physical barriers. You have to find a quiet corner away from the chaos.
Because the broader psychological picture here revolves around how humans process trauma and stress. Unspoken pain does not just evaporate over time.
It definitely doesn't.
It gets stored in the body. It calcifies into chronic stress, resentment, and depression. But when that pain is externalized, when it is shared in a truly safe, undistracted space with someone who is actively bearing witness, it begins to lose its paralyzing grip. The authors make a devastatingly simple observation here. Most relationships do not suffer from a lack of love. They suffer from a deep, systemic lack of listening.
Wow. Let's look at how this active listening actually changes the trajectory of a real situation. Let's go back to the story of Glenn.
Yeah, let's do that.
So, a few days after that intense washroom encounter where Glenn breaks down about his dying father, the narrator follows up. He doesn't just send a generic thinking of you text. He texts Glenn, asks how he takes his coffee, and intentionally sets up a meeting at a local Starbucks on a Wednesday night at 9 p.m.
Which is very intentional.
Very. It's late, it's quiet, and the daily rush is over.
Engineering the exact right physical space to encourage vulnerability, just as the framework suggests.
Right. So they sit down, the coffees are on the table, and the narrator uses one of those revealing questions. He says, "You look tired, Glenn. How was your sleep last night?" And this single question unlocks a massive plot twist in the story. It turns out Glenn's biggest source of panic and overwhelm isn't actually the father dying of cancer in the hospital.
Right, which is wild because the father's diagnosis is the obvious crisis. It's what anyone on the outside would naturally assume is the root of the trauma.
But the reality is completely different. Glenn reveals that his true daily nightmare is the stress of caring for his alcoholic mother living in his basement. It is his deep, consuming fear about how her unpredictable behavior is damaging his young kids.
Right.
And layered on top of that is a burning, toxic resentment toward his sister, who lives a few hours away and refuses to lift a single finger to help.
This narrative perfectly illustrates why the check engine light analogy is so vital. If the narrator had skipped the questions and jumped straight to giving advice, offering, generic platitudes about cancer treatments or grief, he would have entirely missed the actual crushing weight that was destroying Glenn's life.
He would have been trying to fix the wrong engine.
Exactly.
Now, here is the part of the story that made me genuinely skeptical when I first read it. Right there in the coffee shop, after hearing this heavy emotional confession, the narrator reaches into his pocket and slots 2 printed sheets of paper across the table to Glenn. One is a caregiver self-assessment, and the other is a practical needs inventory. And I just have to push back on this tactic. Doesn't pulling out a literal standardized checklist in the middle of a deeply vulnerable conversation feel incredibly clinical? Doesn't that risk turning a moment of connection into a sterile doctor's appointment?
I mean, the skepticism is completely valid. It sounds terribly awkward on paper, but the authors dive into the psychology of why this specific move was actually a masterstroke for someone in Glenn's state.
Okay, I'm listening.
When a person is drowning in caregiver overwhelm, their internal world feels like a blurry, chaotic storm. The emotions are so tangled they can't even see straight. By handing Glenn a physical, objective tool, a standardized quiz developed by healthcare organizations, the narrator gave him cognitive distance. It allowed Glenn to step outside his own spinning mind and look at his life as a set of data points.
Ah, so it bypasses the emotional flooding and engages the logical part of the brain.
Precisely. The mechanism of scoring himself was the key. Glenn sat in that coffee shop, reading objective statements about fatigue and stress, and applying a numerical value to his feelings. When he tallied up the final score, the data was undeniable. He looked up and said, "I guess I'm not doing fine, am I?"
Wow.
The clinical nature of the tool is exactly what broke through his final layer of denial. And the second sheet, the practical needs inventory, harnessed that clarity. Instead of the narrator saying, "Let me know if you need anything," which, by the way, places the burden back on the caregiver to figure out what they need, it offered a menu.
A menu of help.
Right. It listed concrete tasks, laundry, snow shoveling, driving to medical appointments, meal prep.
But the wild part, the thing that really shifts perspective, is what Glenn actually selected from that massive list of chores. He didn't ask for someone to mow his lawn or cook his dinners. He only put an X next to 2 highly specific things.
And those 2 selections really highlight the hidden spiritual and emotional toll. First, he selected spiritual care. Glenn confessed that the situation was causing him severe anxiety, and he felt deep religious guilt about not trusting God enough. So he agreed to be connected with a pastor to talk through that specific shame.
And the second one?
Second, he selected prayer support. He didn't want someone to fix his mother. He and the narrator agreed to a strictly scheduled 30-minute phone call every Wednesday at 9 p.m. The purpose of the call was simply to talk, debrief the week, and pray.
Which proves something so crucial for anyone trying to help. You do not have to fix everything. You don't have to move into the person's basement and take over the nursing duties. You just need to offer a specific, reliable, unwavering presence.
And that realization that presence outweighs solutions forms the foundation of the actionable framework the authors synthesize at the close of the guide. They organize this approach into a highly memorable acronym, which is CARE.
Let's walk through the psychology of that CARE framework real quick, because it maps perfectly onto Glenn's journey.
Sure. So the C stands for connect. This is about overcoming the bystander effect. It is the active decision to notice the person who looks worn down, to cross the room, and to initiate contact. It requires pushing past the awkwardness of interrupting someone's day.
You are actively choosing to look past the "I'm fine" shield.
Guys.
And then comes the A, which is ask.
Ask is the deployment of those revealing, open-ended questions. How is your sleep? How are you really? It is the willingness to invite the messy truth into the open, knowing you can't actually solve it.
Which leads directly to the R, meaning respond. But crucially, as the guide stresses, you respond with active listening, catching the medicine ball. You respond by acknowledging the difficulty of their reality and then offering specific, bounded help perhaps, using an inventory tool rather than just empty promises.
And the final piece, the E, is encourage. This is where most support systems fail, honestly. Caregiving is a marathon, not a sprint. People are great at bringing casseroles during week 1 of a crisis.
Right, the initial wave of support.
Exactly. But Encourage is about month 6. It is the commitment to follow up over time. It is those Wednesday night 9 p.m. phone calls, week after week, reminding the caregiver that they have not been forgotten as the crisis drags on.
Now, the guide embeds a very specific piece of spiritual advice throughout this whole process, and I think the psychological utility of it is fascinating, regardless of your personal background. They insist that before you even approach a caregiver to connect or ask, you should take a moment to pray for yourself.
Yeah, the authors recommend a very specific posture in that prayer, asking for the ability to listen well, to care deeply, and to trust in the ultimate outcome. If we analyze the psychology of that practice, it's really a tool for ego suppression.
Ego suppression, I like that.
Right. It forces the helper to consciously drop the hero complex. It shifts your internal focus away from the anxiety of needing to say the perfect thing or fix an unfixable tragedy and moves you into a state of surrender. You are reminding yourself that you are not responsible for curing the cancer or solving the family addiction. You are only responsible for being present.
So what does this all mean when we distill it down to our daily lives? The greatest gift you can possibly give someone who is completely overwhelmed isn't a clever logistical solution. It isn't a perfectly timed, eloquent piece of advice. The ultimate gift is simply the willingness to step into the mess with them and actively share the weight of the burden.
Absolutely.
It's looking at their flashing check engine light, pulling up a chair and saying, yeah, I see the smoke too. Let's just sit here together for a minute.
And the source text leaves us with an incredibly profound paradigm shift regarding why we should invest our energy into this. It isn't just about altruism. The authors point out a statistical certainty. If you live long enough, it is almost guaranteed that every single one of us will eventually become either a caregiver or someone who desperately requires care.
There is no escaping that reality. It is the universal human destination. So here is your challenge for this week. I want you to mentally scan your orbit. Think about your office, your neighborhood, your extended family. Find that one person who seems to be perpetually rushing, who might be quietly carrying a heavy load behind a polite smile.
They're out there.
They are. Engineer a quiet moment, buy them a coffee, and just ask them, how are you really? Be fully prepared to catch the medicine ball. Help them peel the black tape off their dashboard. Let them know they don't have to pretend the engine isn't smoking anymore.
Because the best possible preparation for our own inevitable future is to walk alongside a caregiver today. How we choose to show up for them right now is the exact training ground where we learn to navigate the hardest seasons of our own lives. You just have to be willing to open the door.